My job today would be to introduce you to some of the experiments that we have started over the last few years in our country, and I'll drive you through a set of them. Italy is a country known for many things, but certainly not for our skills or experience in randomized controlled trials. And not even for our evidence-based policies. You know, politics is a hot topic in our country, and policies.
In our country too.
Yeah, I know. I know the word is not so different actually, and so quite many of our policies in the educational field, in the social field, in the health sector as well, are probably more based on political debate or ideological background rather than on evidence. I was trained as an economist. I teach economics and evaluation of social services at the Catholic University, so I'm not an expert in politics. I'm much more involved in policy evaluation, so I won't be able to drive you through the secrets of Italian politics, but I'll try to give you a hint of what goes on in the evaluation field. I also had a chance over the last years to work as a person in charge of evaluation for a non-profit grant-making foundation in Italy, which is called the Cariplo Foundation. Cariplo is by far the largest grant maker in our country. It's a foundation originated from the transformation of Italian savings banks at the beginning of the 90s. And the foundation gives out about 100 million euros in grants every year to NGOs and government in our country. And so I had the task to understand whether the grants the foundation was making were effective or not, whether they were changing or solving at least the problems that they were addressed to. So we are not famous for these reasons, and therefore we quite often do not base our policies on sound evidence, as it is generally said. We prefer round evidence, not quite the same, or for some time we also preferred totally untrustable promises. Something is changing, but not so much right now. Quite luckily, something is changing in our country, probably the least prone country in Europe to undertake counterfactual analysis, but something actually is changing. We had some new facts over the last year. A new public institution expressly devoted to evaluate public policy, IRVAT, is based in Trento in northern Italy. It's closer to Europe and less to the Mediterranean, so that's probably the reason why. And we also have an increasing number of RCT, randomized controlled trials, aimed at evaluating the results of intervention in the educational field as well as in the social field. These randomized controlled trials are run by several different institutions, mainly at the university level. University of Trento, University of Padua, the Catholic University of Milan, where I teach, and some public institutions as well, especially in the educational field. In Valsi, the National Institute for the Evaluation of Education Policy in Rome is one of the few institutions running counterfactual experiments in Italy. There are several of these evaluations going on, and they are at different stages of their development. Some of them have already been done and are now finished. Some of them are in the phase of delivery of the intervention, and some of others are also just designing the randomized controlled trial. I give you just an incomplete list of what is going on, mainly in the field of education. Over the last year, we have been trying to assess the impact of professional development of teachers in southern Italy to see whether training and education of teachers improve their teaching performance. We have been teaching chess to primary school students to see whether that improved their math performance. You know, Italy is not doing very well in the international compared tests, the PISA test, for example. We do have a problem with mathematics, especially in southern Italy. And so some new methodology for teaching math have been tested. There have been some intervention outside the educational field. I'll talk a little bit about coaching mentally ill people to favor labor market inclusion. It's not in the educational field, it's something quite different, but through that experiment we have been able to develop some skills that are quite interesting, at least in my opinion. We have been providing information to support university choices of students to see whether their choices were changing or not. We have been experiencing, and I will stop a little bit on this experiment as well, been using family group conference, which is a typical social science technique or method and using it in schools to see whether this could improve well-being of students in the lower secondary school, and so on. So as you can see, there have been quite many interventions, either already done or in their delivering phase or that are being planned for the future. I won't be able to, and you will be bored and you will fall asleep if I talk about all of them, so I will focus on a limited set of number. But what is quite clear, and this is one of the points I would like to make, is that the logic behind the development of randomized controlled trial in Italy is quite peculiar, meaning there is almost no, or a very limited at least, demand for evaluation coming from policymakers, the public authorities in particular. They're not very interested about what works and what doesn't work in policies. And so the development of tests and evaluation came mostly from the bottom, from practitioners to a certain extent, and from evaluators themselves on the other side. So limited demand for evaluation coming from policymakers, some demand coming from outside the country, from external funders. You probably know better than I do that policymakers in Europe are changing the way they fund intervention, and they condition sometimes, at least in the Progress or in the EASY program that some of you might know, they condition their funding of their interventions, their policies, to sound evaluation being made by researchers. So demand is coming from practitioners through a bottom-up process. Demand is coming from sources of funds outside the country, and these funds are becoming more and more relevant in our policy making, given the economic and financial crisis of our state. And of course, there is pressure coming from the supply side, let's say, from evaluators themselves. Evaluators started proposing demonstration studies to prospective funders, and they were proposing to evaluate some programs that were already been run by policymakers. The point is that we miss a genuine demand for evaluation coming from policymakers, and that's a problem. That's a problem for the effectiveness of policies in our country. And what is very peculiar is the last sentence. Evaluators play an active role, and that might be a problem. I will come later to that, because it might bias the intervention, because evaluators are much more interested in what could be evaluated according to certain standards, more than what is relevant for policy making. So that's one of the possible problems. But what we see right now is that evaluators tend to raise funds for both funding the intervention and funding the evaluation, which is very unusual, untypical at least, to my knowledge. I will be concentrating on 4, if you don't fall asleep earlier, on 4 intervention. Chess, and you see the different colors right now means where did they come from. Teaching chess is a program which were asked by policymakers, while the following 2 programs, coaching mentally ill people and improving school performance of non-native students, were designed and promoted by evaluators, while the last one is a pre-existing intervention that evaluators have been proposing to evaluate to policymakers. I go with the first one. The general idea was, can we find a low-cost intervention that might improve math performance in schools? So the policy question behind this intervention was, how could we increase the math performance of Italian students? There have been quite many interventions in this field in the past. Training teachers, using computerized programs to improve math performance, and so on. The problem is that not so many of these interventions have been evaluated, so we simply don't know whether they were effective or they were not. This is quite typical of our country. We use this best practice approach. What is the best practice? Generally, what I do is the best practice, of course, but without any proof for something more than that. So what was the idea behind this experiment? We can use a very light and not expensive treatment, 30 hours of chess training, and taught by an external qualified chess master. That was done in year 2010-2011, to a sample of schools. It was a non-probabilistic sample, something that Pavel told you before. It was simply schools that were available to enter the program. These schools were randomized at the class level, so it's a 2-level experiment. Some of the classes were considered as treated, 60 classes with about 1,000 students or pupils, and some other classes were randomized as controls, non-treated. The general idea was to see whether these 30 hours of chess could improve or not the math performance of students. In order to find out whether these classes were effective or not, students were administered with a test, which was administered before intervention and after the intervention to both treated and controlled classes. The test is a sort of is inspired to the national test of student capacity, the Invalsi assessment, which is close to the PISA international test. They had, because this was done by Alberto Martini, Gianluca Argentina, and Barbara Romano, they had almost perfect compliance. And this is one of the advantages of running experiments in schools. The students can't flee away. And you always have your tests done. What was the result of this intervention? This figure represents the performance of students before the class were administered. You can see the percentage of the pretest scores, pretest score distribution, and you see the 2 different curves. The dotted line is the treated students, and the full line is controls. So this is what happened before the chess class, and this is what happens after the chess class. So what we can see is, in principle, we can see that there is a difference between pre and post test. We can, to a certain extent, conclude that the intervention was effective in improving the mathematical achievement of these students. I don't want to go into detail of the analysis. Pavel did it before my intervention. What I would like to underline now is some of the puzzling questions that came out of the experiment. One of the objection we had to this measurement was, well, it could be that you get this improvement simply because you're asking questions in an unfair, in a biased way. Meaning, training in chess means getting some new skills in geometry, for example. You learn how to move pieces on the chess table, on the chess, what do you call it? The scacchiera, chessboard, great, on the chessboard. And so you improve your geometry performance because of that. The idea was, therefore, you have to be quite careful. You have to be sure that you don't have a biased test in order to measure your performance. And the way was, we do introduce different items and check whether we have not just an average improvement, but we have an improvement of all the different items of the test we are administering to people. The second question that came out, the Deville question. Are you measuring the impact of chess teaching or some additional time in education? Meaning, it could have been that if people stayed at school longer, they would simply improve their performance, regardless of what they do. Is it chess, or is it just time with more time with adult people that can help you improve your learning skills in general? And so this is one of crucial question in particular. If you think that in practice what they get was additional time in math education, you should control for these variables. And the idea behind this design was, well, let's teach chess instead of teaching math, so that the total amount of time devoted to this kind of teaching remain the same. And the final question, which is very common in Italy, are you sure you're measuring correctly the impact, or they're just cheating? I don't know whether you read, there was a nice piece of literature over the last few months about cheating in the national test. It's a real problem in Italy, actually. And so the usual way for controlling whether there was or there was not cheating is to control not just for the average, but for the standard deviation of results. Meaning it's quite unlikely that all of the students improve the same way. So control results and see whether you have a certain standard deviation within a class or not. Check for mean and standard deviation into single classes. If you find high mean and low standard deviation, that's a good hint of some cheating behind. What's going on right now? The chess test is going to have a follow-up. And this is quite convenient because once you started a program in the educational system, you can use national tests to measure over time the long-term impact of your intervention. They administer a test before intervention and a test after the intervention, but they can use a national standardized test to measure the long-term performance of their students over time. And this is what this slide is showing. They had that intervention in primary school, but they can control long-term results without spending any more money, simply using the national test in math and language at different levels, and those are the levels where we test the students at the national level in 5th grade, in 8th grade, 10th grade, and 13th grades. So that's the very first experience. The second intervention is a more complicated one, and therefore is more expensive and more time consuming. this was funded pari opportunità, which means equal opportunities for foreign students, were funded by the CARIPRO Foundation. Evaluation was taken by the Bocconi University, and we don't have final results, so what I'm just presenting nowadays are unpublished materials. The general policy question is as this. In Italy, we have quite many students of foreign origin right now. More than 10% of the students' population was not born in Italy, or was born in Italy from parents not being born in Italy, so first or second generation students. What we can quite easily see is that foreign students, even though they have good skills, they tend to choose, let's say, easy tracks in high school, or they tend to make choices which are quite different from the choices made by Italian students. Even though they are quite good, they go to professional training rather than to more challenging high schools. This is a problem, of course, because we are going to have separation in the job market, with the students of foreign origin just making the low-skills jobs, and Italian students concentrating all over the spectrum. And it's a risky behavior in principle. We are wasting resources. We could have people undertaking more challenging school tracks and more challenging profession. So the question was, how could we make the high school choices of foreign students more similar to those of Italian students? Is it possible? What are the chances we have? The CARIPRO Foundation, I was in charge of this program since the very beginning, and we ran a preliminary analysis, and we found out with a large consultation of experts in the field that there are several possible reasons for that behavior. The first one was very easy. Foreign students coming from families of lower economic possibility simply have to go to work earlier than Italian students. They can't afford to go to the university. They have to gain their wage and help their families. There was nothing we could do in that field, but informing that not necessarily attending a high school, a more challenging high schools, a school that prepares you to the university level, means that if you drop out, if you go directly on the job market, if you don't go to university, you are in worse shape than if you go to a specific training school. In fact, what we see in the job market is that people coming from challenging high school, what we call the liceo, I guess something similar here, liceo, right, get higher wages when they go to the job market, even though they don't finish their universities. So this was a sort of information, or what we call educational guidance. Of course, we could not afford to fill the gap in wages or help families directly transferring money to families, but we could show to them that it's not true, that a more challenging high school means you have to go to the university. The second reason behind those differences in choices, at least to the expert we consulted with, was that, well, foreign students, they tend to speak Italian pretty well, even though they entered the country at a certain age, when they were 8 or 9 or whatever. They learn the language quite easily, but they learn a language which is very useful to speak with their peers, and not as much a more formal language which is needed for completing more challenging studies. So the general idea was, can we fill these two gaps? Stronger training in formal language, or language for the study, as we call it, and educational guidance for 7th and 8th graders students, and moreover for their families, which is probably where the decision is taken. It's not the specific student that decides his future, but it's more like a family decision. We devised this intervention as a positive discrimination intervention, meaning we don't want every single foreign student going to the university. Of course, that wouldn't make any sense. But we do believe that the best students, regardless of their origin, should be in the condition to go to university. Therefore, the sample population was the set, about 140 schools in northern Italy. The Calipro Foundation only funds intervention in the northern part of the country. You know that Italy it's a country to a certain extent. It's more a set of different countries together. We choose the 140 schools in northern Italy that had more than 20 foreign students in 6th grade in year 2010-2011. And in those schools, we decided to devote our intervention to the 10 best foreign students. Okay, not the whole population, but just the subsamples of the best students in those. We randomized at the school level, so 70 schools were randomly chosen as part of the treatment, for being part of the treatment, while 70 were chosen for being controls. Of course, the control students don't even know they are controls, which is quite good and something, because we only use a standardized test to measure our results. And this is one of the problems we will have to come back to. We measure two main outcomes. The first outcome, we want to measure whether whether the treatment we made changed students' admission to the final exam that we take in 8th grade in Italy. And we had some results. I showed you the most relevant ones. If we consider intention to treat, meaning, of course, some of the students that were admitted to treatment simply didn't show up. So what we measure is the result we got on average on all students. And we get a decrease in general in non-admission, a 25% decrease in non-admission to the final exam, which is quite interesting, but this result is not statistically significant. That means it could depend simply on random factors. What we do have, and this is quite interesting, is a 53% decrease in non-admission for male students. So the intervention was effective for male, but not for females. If we measure in a different way what is called use instrumental variables, and we measure a sort of average treatment of the treated, and as an instrumental variable we use students attending more than 75% of the treatment, we see a very strong and statistically significant effect on males. The difference between foreign students and Italian students in non-admission to the final exam almost disappeared. So it was actually very effective. This is kind of interesting because these differences that we can see also on the second outcome, changing choices for high schools, we have about the same result, much more strong and significant, statistically significant effect for males than for female students. This is kind of interesting because probably there was some kind of fault in our preliminary analysis. And it came out later that, in fact, availability of data is one of the issues. We were not able to see that that discriminatory behavior that was at the basis of our intervention was much stronger for males than for females. Foreign female students made choice is not so far different, not so different from Italian female students, while male students were strongly discriminated, especially, I don't have the time right now, but it came out that the results were particularly strong for students coming from South American, students of South American origin. So there is something which is connected to being a male or a female student. So this is what are the lessons that we can learn for this kind of intervention. First one, preliminary investigation is pretty crucial. If you don't want to waste resources and money, you have to be careful to define precisely the problem you are confronting with. We made a mistake. We thought that this kind of discrimination was widespread across all sexes, which was not true. Data availability is one of the questions. We were not able to get good data to test our hypothesis at the very beginning. And so if you look at the website of the Caripro Foundation, you find, most unfortunately it's in Italian actually, but you'll find the preliminary studies we published before the intervention, and you see that given the data we were able to get access to, we had a good interpretation of the phenomenon, but that was not enough. The information we collected after the intervention allowed us to define more precisely the problem we were confronting with. Therefore, targeting is a crucial question. The second question is, of course, is data availability. Administrative data were available after the intervention, but they came from different sources. We had the General Ministry of Education on the one side, and the INVALSI, the Institute for the Evaluation of the performance of the educational system on the other side. And believe it or not, they don't talk to each other. Simply, we were not able, or we had a very hard time in making them talk to each other. So we had on the one side the information on specific students and their results at the national tests, but we were not able to connect those results to the choices they made. And that's one of the problems. I hope in this country you're in better shape, but this is one of the questions we have to confront with. And the third question that came out at the very end, and it's something you can confront with once you know whether you are effective or not with your intervention, is that if we go back to the previous result, on average, we have a statistically significant impact on the population, but this impact is relatively small. We change only 10% of the choices, so to say. And given that this kind of intervention was time-consuming and quite expensive, one of the questions that has been raised right now is, well, was it worth doing? Are the benefits of the intervention higher than the cost of the intervention or not? Should we do that just because it's correct from the ethical point of view to give equal chances to all students, or we could spend our money in a better way? So these are some of the questions that came out of this sort of thing. The third intervention I would like to mention briefly is what is called the family group conferences in school. I don't know whether you know something about family group conferences. Has any of you ever heard about that? No. So I have to go through a little bit. The policy question is just about this one. We can see that well-being and good performance at junior high school are good predictors of future academic or educational results in general. Students performing well and in junior high school tend to perform well in senior high school and the university, that they do not drop out, and so on. And a second hypothesis or is that parental involvement is a condition for improving well-being at school. You don't give up your parental responsibility to teachers only. You have to be involved in order to improve the performance of your sons and your daughters and in school. So the question was, how could we involve parents and increase well-being of students to improve their academic careers in the future? This was something we learned at the university. It was a cross-fertilization between economists and social workers. Some of our colleagues at the social work department were using this family group conference model to deal with children having strong problems with their families and with the authorities. What is the family group conference? It's a meeting. It's a meeting where children, their parents, and people involved with the education of a child are convened in order to develop a plan that can improve the well-being of that child. The general idea is what sociologists, you are more expert than I am, call empowerment. Give back power to the the primary educators, such as the family. Give back responsibility to deal with their own problems. Don't professionalize too much intervention, but try to have people take their own responsibility. This kind of methodology has been used quite extensively in the social field, particularly for dealing with children having strong and relevant problems in their own life, neglected, abuse, or something similar. The technique is quite easy. There's a person, which is called the referrer, in general is a social worker, that sees a problem with a child, and then he asks a facilitator, a third party, to convene the family and the relevant, all people relevant to the child in a meeting, the so-called family group conference, to share information about the problem the child is meeting, to have some private time to devise a plan to tackle those problems, and to finally agree with the plan. That's very easy, very inexpensive, pretty much in the idea of giving back power to the family simply by informing that some problem is going on. Then the family and the relevant ones are in charge of the plan implementation, and then after some time you have a second meeting, a second family group conference, a review meeting to see whether the plan was implemented as it was supposed and what kind of results they had. Okay, the actors are those that I already mentioned, a child which is experiencing some difficulties, the wild family or wild family members, not just the father and the mother, but the uncle, the grandparents, and also some people who may not be members of their own family, but who may play a role in tackling the child problems. A facilitator, which is a non-professional worker, which is acting as a facilitator of the meeting. I don't want to go into detail for the advocate or professionals. So if you are interested, I'll give you some bibliography. What are the key features? It's a very light welfare intervention. It's not expensive. And this is very important, at least in our country at this time. The participation is voluntary, so it is seen by the families as something not giving stigma. It's a very light process. It's centered on the child, it's family-led, and it's based on the strength of the family network. There have been some previous studies on the effectiveness of family group conferences. Most of them have been undertaken in the field of child protection, and the evidence about their effectiveness is pretty weak. Social workers are very proud of this kind of experience, and they tend to apply anytime they can. They say, well, it works very well, the climate is nice, but we simply don't know whether this kind of treatment improves the condition of children or not. And the results, the few studies that have been made are actually very mixed for two different reasons. One is that the methodology used is often quite faulty. And the second one is that you get very different results. Some studies say, well, it works very well. Some others say it doesn't work at all. So the general idea we had was, can we try and use this methodology not for children experiencing strong problems, like those that involve child protection, but for students experiencing lighter problems at the school level. We do believe that involving the family might be more effective when students are confronting with a problem in their relationship with their peers or with their teachers, rather than with kind of abuse, with problems like abuse or so on. So the idea is use this light methodology to tackle light well-being problems at the school level. The study is taking place near Milano. We started in 2 years ago, actually. We'll conclude the intervention. We already concluded the intervention. We still have a follow-up investigation to run. So that's the idea. It's a preventive tool. Teachers in the population was 14 schools in a district not far from Milano. We asked teachers in those schools to name about 350 students that might have problems which could be solved by a family group conference treatment. So the referral was based on teachers. And in order to assess the effectiveness of the intervention, we ran 2 rounds of questionnaires, pre and post questionnaires, to the whole population of the schools where the intervention took place. So we had information about 2,600 students in those schools. Besides that, we also have information about administrative data. It's not just a questionnaire about how they feel, they behave in schools. It's more something harder, meaning did those students go to school or not? What were their performance in different topics and so on. The program was started by practitioners and evaluators. So what we had was a strong interaction between evaluation and practitioner, and those who implemented actually the program, which had some positive and on the other side some negative effect. The positive effect was, well, we as evaluators were pretty interested in knowing very well the effect of what we were measuring. Family group conference, as often happens in social work treatments, were not very well defined. Meaning, well, we do have some meetings. Well, what do you do in those meetings? Well, at the end we have, we drink and eat something together, which is not, of course, not bad, but probably that's not the crucial part of the treatment. So, as evaluators, we ask the practitioner to make protocols of the intervention much better than they had before. They were very reluctant at the beginning, said, well, you can't do that. Every case it's a different story. And there is no general treatment in this field. But at the end, we were able to have a decent, at least to our opinion, protocol of the intervention, so that now we can say, well, we are measuring the impact of these set of actions. There was quite interest in the model and in the measurement of the effect of that model coming from teachers and school leaders. They were very interested in having some help in dealing with problems of the students, because there is social service and school educational system are not very much connected, unless you have a very terrible case of a student which is destroying the school. In that case, social services intervene, but in other cases that simply doesn't happen. So teachers have to deal on their own with a student with light behavior problems, they have, such as dealing with their peers or with teachers as well. So they were very interested in some intervention that might help them. At the very beginning, they were scared by the idea of randomizing students. And actually they opposed to that idea, saying, well, we do know exactly who are those who deserve this treatment and those who don't deserve it. Why do you want to randomly choose them, running the risk to give this intervention to someone who is not as deserving as it could be? But in the end, what we were able to explain and to work, it took a lot of time, of course, and it was very time-consuming and expensive in a general sense to explain why this was the main reason. We had a very low level of attrition in data collection, and that's one of the advantages of working with students, as I mentioned before. But as I'll show it to you in a while, we had a quite high attrition rate, or a problem of compliance. And randomization worked pretty fine. The two samples of treated and control were well balanced. What were the main problems? We were expecting about 350 students referred to the treatment. We didn't get that many. We only got 261. Therefore, of course, we had lower statistical power, and 350 was the idea to have a significant minimum detectable effect. We didn't get that, and that was an issue that we had to deal with teachers in a quite tough way. They said, well, you cannot force us to refer students who are not deserving or who don't need on the one side, and on the other side we said, well, if you don't have enough cases, we won't be able to say whether it works or not. And it was one of the topics. Second problem, we had a quite a relevant level of non-compliance, meaning out of the 131 students which were randomized for the treatment, only 84 completed the process, meaning that families were simply not complying. They say, well, I don't want my son or my daughter to be part of the treatment. And this is something of course you can deal with from a statistical point of view, but you have a problem actually. And then the process was much more time consuming than expected. And when we had the second round of questionnaires, some family group conference meetings were still pending. Therefore, it's hard to say that we were measuring the effect of something that had not happened yet. And this is a problem, of course. We measure some results coming from the questionnaires. The dependent variable are, family support, relation with teachers, satisfaction about school, and skill self-assessment. Results are very encouraging. We haven't finished our analysis yet, but we see good results in all fields. One of the questions, of course, is it a real effect, or is something simply perceived by students? Students being devoted more time simply feel better. They don't actually perform better, but they feel better simply because someone has been taking care of them. So this is one of the issues we're going to confront with over in the next future. I want to well, I skip all of these things. You can have a look at it yourself. I want to focus on the last case study, which is something outside the educational field, because there is just one piece of information that we can get from this problem, from this intervention. Here the policy question is completely different. It has nothing to do with education. It has something to do with people suffering some kind of mental disease, and it's a major problem in our country. Lombardy, the region where Milano, where I come from, is located, has about 130,000 people suffering from some sort of mental disease out of a population of about 9 million people. So it's very relevant. You're mad, all mad over there. Jobs are generally considered a good therapy for people with mental disease, but what we can see, in fact, is that stigma is very strong, and only a very limited fraction of people with mental disease actually work. So the idea was, how could we increase the share of people with mental sickness having a regular job? And the idea was very easy. It was copied from someone else, in fact. It was the idea of case management. Services for mentally diseased people are pretty, are very strong in our country, but they are built as if on the other side you had a rational consumer. They don't work together. You have a doctor at the hospital level, you have the practitioner at the local level, you have the job centers. They simply don't talk to each other. They assume that on the other side there's a rational consumer going to the first service when I don't feel very well, I need a pill, so I go to a doctor. Then now I feel better, so I could try and write my CV to see whether I can find a job, so I go to the job center. The point is that on the other side you don't have a rational consumer, you have a mentally ill people, and it simply doesn't work like that. So the idea is, can we have someone who is taking care of the person and not of the service? So a coach, as we called it. The idea is that the coach takes care of a limited number of psychiatric patients, 10, and he drives them through the network of public and private services that provide services for these people. We had a sample of about 300 people aged between 18 and 50 with major psychiatric disease. They were diagnosed. Their diagnosis came from a medical doctor, and it was they were bipolar, schizophrenic, and with correlated disease. And they were already in charge of 4 social and health services in the 4 different provinces. We used to have provinces. We're now getting rid of them in Italy, in Lombardy. They were in stable condition, but they were not working. And the 4 provinces were the one you see over there: Bergamo, Como, Milano, Sondrio. So in total we had about 300 people that were randomly assigned to treatment or control, and so about 150 on each group. The impact. These lines show the percentage of people. The blue line is the treated people, and the red line is control, who had a job at different times of the treatment. Of course, you get very close to 0. Sorry, something changed. This is before the treatment. This is the enrollment phase, and this is the intervention, and this is post-treatment. So it was very close to 0 in the enrollment phase. Of course, we just wanted people who were not working, of course. And as you can see, from the point of view of jobs, the intervention was not quite a success. There is a certain difference here at the end when we measure for last time the effect of our intervention, but this difference is not statistically significant, meaning it might be simple the consequence of random choices that they work a little bit more. Something different we can see where we measure apprenticeship rather than a true job. Here we see a very relevant difference in the phase of the intervention. And well, when the intervention ends, everything gets back to normality, business as usual. If you put the two of them together, we see that we got most of the effect because of apprenticeship and not because of true jobs. So, for a certain point of view, this intervention is a failure, actually. We can see that we don't make any difference, any relevant difference. But on the other side, I think we learn quite many lessons. First thing, professional coaches work or not? Well, if we measure the job effect, we could say no, they don't work actually. But if, as some literature is suggesting, they do have an impact, and this impact is quite clear, on apprenticeship, and if we think that apprenticeship is a precondition for actually entering the job market, then we might say, well, they might work. So some more specific analysis is needed. This was quite interesting because in this experiment we have been able to see what spillover effect meant. Let's get back to apprenticeship. Treated and controlled people were selected into the same local services, meaning a doctor at the local level referred a certain number of people, and those people were randomly assigned either to treatment or to control. In principle, doctors and practitioners were pretty much in favor of the randomization. In practice, they perceived themselves as being judged by the result of the treatment. Therefore, maybe unintentionally, what we saw at the very beginning was that they were trying to counterbalance the effect of the treatment, or the possible effect of treatment, to compensate those who were randomly assigned to the control group with extra intervention. If you have a look at the very beginning here, you see that for the first month, controls perform much better than treated people. In our opinion, this is a clear sign of what we call a spillover effect, of contamination, actually. We should have devised the experiment better. We should have chosen not people into the same local services, but we should have assigned different services to treatment and control, as we did with schools. Otherwise, you have problems with schools with the foreign students intervention. Otherwise, you might have problem in controlling spillover effects. And this was a good lesson as well. So pay attention to the experimental design before starting it. Are data available? This is another question. The intervention was relatively cheap. Collecting information was very expensive at the very beginning. Why? Because we didn't have any administrative data available, and we have to go and interview and with the questionnaire each of the 313 patients, which is, of course, a quite high cost. So if administrative data are available, they're much better to use. We do now have something coming from the so-called compulsory communication of job that every employer has to fill in once he employs someone, so something is going better now. And then the fourth question is, this experiment took a long time, as you can see. It's almost 4 years. Policymakers are not so much available at waiting such a long time. They want fast and possible positive results in a very short time. So a good strategy would be Well, if possible, devise something which you can measure in a relatively short time span. And this is all that some final lesson learned. Well, the first one is that something that we were not betting on at the very beginning. Randomized controlled trials are viable in Italy. We could do that, even though there was strong opposition coming both from policymakers in simply by showing no demand for those kind of evidence, and quite strong opposition coming from the academy, from some leading evaluators, which are not used to this kind of methodology and preferred qualitative evaluation tools. But actually, you could do that, and in some cases, you could do that with a relatively limited amount of money. We didn't have strong negative reactions. We do have some reaction to measurement in general. You know that when the PISA tests are made in schools every year, we have some schools saying, well, we don't do that. Some teachers saying, you don't have to measure this way, and all this sort of things, which of course are true. I mean, quantitative analysis is not enough. You need something more than that. But it's necessary anyway. So it can be done in our country. No strong negative reaction. A group of quite skilled evaluators, a small group, is enough to start. And then it's like a snowball effect. Once you show that it can be done, some other people will come in. And if you have institutional data, they are a powerful tool. And we do have at the educational level. We still have to make people talk to each other, the National Evaluation Center and the ministry, but data are there. And so it's not impossible, in principle, to have the two of them talk together. What is quite clear is that in Italy, evaluators play a strange role. In other countries, they are simply asked by policymaker or practitioner to come in and evaluate. In our country, they actually they play a much more active role in trying to spread evaluation practices in the country. And this is quite unusual in first thing, and it has both opportunities and risks. Some we already mentioned earlier, the involvement of evaluators in designing treatments has some good consequences, meaning they might help structuring the program that is going to be evaluated with the randomized controlled trial. So the evaluators might have an interesting role in improving protocol definition, and they might have a role in checking and amending weak implementation. So they can have a positive effect. On the other side, evaluators participating in the planning phases of a program get also a very deep knowledge of how the program works, which is quite important in, I believe, in shaping a correct evaluation. Quite often you see evaluators coming from the moon and saying, well, you have to do like this, but they simply don't know what goes on over there. Of course, if evaluators are pretty much involved in designing not just the experiment, but in designing the intervention, their bona fide, as we call them, their correctness becomes crucial. They don't need to have their own agenda on the issue which is going to be evaluated. Otherwise, they might influence, of course, final results. There are some negative sides of the evaluation involvement, because evaluators could, of course, distort the program, meaning they could, for example, tend to bend the intervention on more measurable results, not necessarily relevant from the policy point of view. What we are interested in is what we can measure, not what is important for policy making. And this is quite normal for scholars. We have to publish our papers, and so if something can be measured, we are quite sure that we can publish final results, whether they are positive or negative, doesn't matter. If something is not measurable, then we do have a problem. But that might be the most relevant part of the policy intervention. So that's something we should be taken into account. The stronger risk, and probably the most relevant risk from the point of view of policy making, is that if demand only comes from evaluators, you might have nice papers published, but then you don't change the policy making. Meaning, well, we run a program, we saw that it worked or it didn't work, but then it's over. Policymakers simply don't use the results if they're not interested in. It's not the result that make their interest increase. So that's one of the questions we should confront with. What's going on? I do believe that in the short run, not much will change in our country, meaning that it will be mostly evaluator who will push for future evaluation. So we'll work for promoting, financing, and evaluating some sort of intervention. One of the lessons learned is that we cannot sell very well a long-term intervention, very expensive, not time anymore. So most likely we'll see shorter intervention that can be kept relatively cheap. Something that might be interesting is that we could sell the idea of filling some gaps in policy caused by the economic crisis. The economic crisis asks for more selection in policy making. And so it might be easier to sell to policymakers the idea of, well, if we can devise an intervention which is performing better than others, you probably can save some money. It's not a matter of filling the gaps in policy, it's more like the question of saving the money that can be sold to policymakers. And most likely there will be more pressure for randomized controlled trial coming from outside sources of funds which are outside our country, mostly the European Union. We have seen a quite strong change in the attitude of European policymakers in that direction, and I think the country will be forced to move. Italy will be forced to move in that direction as well because of external pressure more than internal forces. Well, thank you so much. I think that's it.